Welcome back to Change Ed.
Change Ed. Why do you yell it?
Because everyone loves it and they requested it. That's all the fan mail says. We love when you yell Change Ed.
Is this a special email box that I'm unaware of?
Yeah. It's the talent at changeed.org.
So a non-existent email that all your fictional friends send. Okay, gotcha.
I'm your host, Andrew Kuhn, education consultant from Montgomery County Intermediate Unit. And here with me is
Patrice Semachek, an educational consultant from the Montgomery County Intermediate Unit as well.
Patrice does not have all of our clearances to access the top tier email accounts that we have in Change Ed.
It's okay. I'm in a secret society that you don't know about that you'll learn more about in the next episode.
Oh, wait to hear about that. We have a repeat guest, a very huge favoritist
Has
guest.
he been on the podcast before?
Oh, we used a recording of conversations that we had with him before. So maybe this is the first time on the podcast.
Yeah, there we go.
So, but we've used
his audio.
We used his audio with his consent, with his knowledge from conversations that we've had. Nonetheless, we have here with us one of the authors and super influential people on the next generation science standards, and
A goat. He's a goat, if you will. Yeah.
Very helpful to us with all that we're trying to do here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania with steel standards. Brett Molding, and here's what I want to say. We're going to dive right into it, Brett Molding, because they're actually experiencing a unique phenomenon in Utah. He almost had to cancel on us. Brett, I want you just to jump right in. Tell us about this unique phenomenon that you're experiencing.
The phenomenon that we have in northern Utah is we have a south wind before we have a cold front come out of the north. So when low pressure is coming here, we have that high pressure from the south pushing a south wind. We get great warm temperatures, and then overnight it drops down into below freezing. So there's all these weather phenomena happening. If you're paying attention, you can predict the weather. I'm at least as accurate as the U.S. Weather Service because they're only right 50% of the time.
Right.
Well, in baseball, that's a pretty high batting average. So you're doing...
an impossibly high batting average.
Did you tell Brett you had an earthquake today, Andrew?
No, we did. Yeah, I was talking to Patrice, and I said, Patrice, my house is shaking. She's like, do you need to leave? I'm like, maybe. And so then I went outside. I actually put my hand on the ground. Could I feel this? It was fascinating. I was trying to be very scientific about looking at other houses. Can I tell this is, a concern for my house exclusively? But I texted my wife and I said, was your building shaking? She's like, yep. and then the chat started to go, and there was indeed an earthquake.
Well, it's fascinating to me that you have earthquakes along the East Coast or inland from the East Coast. You always think about earthquakes along the Wasatch Front in Utah or San Andreas Fault. In New Madras Fault in the Appalachians is another place where they have earthquakes.
That it happened in New Jersey, but everybody felt it in Pennsylvania.
I've been in quite a few earthquakes in my lifetime. There's two reasons for that. One, I live 5 miles from a major fault. And the second thing, I've lived there a long time. And given enough time, what about earthquakes?
Yeah.
So I've been always fascinated by earthquakes, but on the other hand, I'm always concerned about them. But whenever one happens, I'm immediately go to action to try and observe everything I can see happening, trying to remember where the dogs barked and what was happening, just before that earthquake. And they're kind of an interesting phenomenon. So what are we going to talk about today?
Science.
Yeah, so I got to tell you, Brett, this is very interesting. So much has happened since we met with you. Kind of each time it really pushes us in an expanded direction. We have a monthly magazine that we send out to.
I've seen that.
Yeah, and really our goal with that, as well as with our weekly podcast, is to provide information and help to move the pendulum a little bit, right? If they can't come to us for a day, they can hear it. But also the part that is inspiring with conversations we had with you is, I'm sure you're going to recall this, that there was one time where we were in a Zoom with you and you were talking and you're saying really great stuff. And I'm like, oh man, I couldn't write that down fast enough. Brett, could you say that again? You're like, I absolutely could not say that again, right? Because you were like, it was the moment. I was leaning into the moment and took it, and I couldn't even tell you what I have for breakfast. I can't do it again.
That's something that all teachers know. You work with setting up investigations and engaging kids in things, and then a teaching moment happens and the teacher needs to capture that moment in time. And it's an important part of instruction is that we try to do all this preparation to set up science investigations to create very teachable moments. But that logical sequence needs to make sure that you have the students gathering information and data so that they can have some expertise so that when you have that classroom discourse or small group discussion, they are now experts that you're having the discussion with, not amateur. And that's one of the things that when I engage teachers in professional development, we're modeling the gather, reason, communicate instructional sequence. We want to create expertise amongst the teachers so that when we come to the classroom discourse, which is central to science learning, those teachers now have expertise. Well, teachers want to do that with their students. You don't begin with a discussion hoping that the kids will come up with these really great ideas. What we want to do is prepare them for that by doing hands-on investigations, creating context, having readings that are exact to the investigation for the core ideas. And then you have an audience of experts, and the teacher's job is very much to orchestrate a classroom discussion in which the students bring the expertise and the core ideas to the discussion, and the teacher kind of synthesizes and helps the students synthesize these into scientifically accurate explanations for the causes of phenomena. And, science is about constructing explanations for the causes of phenomena. One of the things I talk with teachers a lot about is this idea that science is a human endeavor. You're going to have an eclipse in a short time from now.
Right.
With or without science, that would happen.
Right.
Science is going to construct explanations for the causes of that phenomenon. So science is about this human endeavor that relies on evidence to support explanations for the cause of phenomena. And the phenomena occur all over, everywhere we go in our world. We use our science as an objective way to construct explanations for what's happening. So that the earthquake doesn't frighten us. We just begin observing it. So that the eclipse doesn't frighten us. So that we're seeing leaves that are spotted and asking ourselves questions and making sense of this phenomenon that we observe in our world. And so science instruction should be authentic by looking at phenomena and constructing explanations. Now, I don't think kids discover these explanations. I think it's more about the students gathering evidence in a setting where the teachers created that teachable moment, where you have kids excited and motivated to learn through doing the hands-on investigation, and then providing them with the accurate, exact readings that they can then gather ideas. Science happens on an observable scale, but the causes of these observable things happening, like my grass turned green, I observe that. I can see it and it's getting taller, but I cannot figure that out by looking at blades of grass every day. It'll not help me. I can have some evidence that grass is changing, but without that reading about what's happening at the molecular scale and at the cellular scale, and that there's organelles in the layers, the top layer of that blade of grass has cells which have chloroplasts in them. I'm not going to ever come up with an explanation for why the grass turned green in the spring. So we need to have the engagement of the investigation, collecting the observable data and engaging kids in that investigation. But then we have to be prepared with an exact reading where the students learn about cell structure and function, that students learn about the core ideas of photosynthesis, and the carbon dioxide from the air and water from the roots are combining in those chloroplasts, energized for that chemical change by sunlight, and turning these two inorganic substances into glucose, and that glucose then becomes celluloses and starches and every other component of the grass, and it turns out the components of human beings even. I'm made of the parts from those same sort of thing. Without photosynthesis, I would not be here on planet Earth. This kind of idea of we're going to engage them in a hands-on investigation, that's mostly to motivate students gathering the information they need and understanding the context so they can make sense of the phenomena. And they have two lines of evidence. They have evidence from observations they make, but they also have that reading that the teacher creates the teaching moment by putting it in place and synthesizes that teaching moment through the classroom discourse, the class discussion. And the other part of it is the core ideas in your Pennsylvania standards, the Steele standards, are really science ideas, concepts, theories, or scientific principles that exist. And we put them into core ideas. And a core idea is simply something that you have a core idea because it has explanatory value across many phenomena, not just one. If I think about one of the ideas, matter is made of particles too small to see, 5th grade. I think about that idea. I use that to make sense of why I can smell cookies baking in the other room, why there's gas bubbles coming up through the water in the pond out there on the ranch, and the gas bubbles are slowly coming out, but when they pop, I can't see them. They're gone. Their matter is still there. When I drop a piece of paper and it floats down, matter is made of particles too small to see, but it is matter, so it has mass. And so what the force pushing up is, in fact, the air molecules with mass being moved out of the way so that the gravity is pulling it down. So I'm using a ton of core ideas but I'm using the same ones over and over and over to make sense of many phenomena. So when they selected core ideas for the framework and next generation science standards, they selected them from laws, principles, and theories that had explanatory value across many phenomena that are observable in the universe. And that's one of the things I think is important for classroom instruction, is that we, in fact, are able to engage in students in making sense of phenomena. And investigations, engineering, design are actually more effective ways for classroom instruction to happen than other traditional methods. That came out of a report from the National Academies called Science and Engineering for grades 6 through 12, Investigation and Design at the Center. And in there, the number one conclusion was that science investigations and engineering design is a more effective way than traditional methods for teaching science. And by effective, what we mean is students remember it, and they remember it longer. Effective science instruction means students are remembering ideas for the rest of their lives, not just for the test on Friday. And that kind of conceptualization of knowledge is a powerful way to make sure students learn for long term. And we're connecting it to prior knowledge and to the experiences they're having in our classrooms and in the relevant world around them, because that's how we learn. You know, the 1999 report that came out called How People Learn described constructivist learning. Everything that's happened since then, the Taking Science to School, Ready, Set, Science, the framework, and Next Generation, all based on this idea of constructivist learning theory, that we build knowledge based on existing experiences and prior knowledge. And so by putting in place rich classroom investigations where students build upon those and they're relevant to their lives, so they can walk outside beyond the classroom and see the same sort of things, is powerful. I think that's important for us to understand. Science instruction, the way we do it, the instructional sequence, has implications for student learning.
Is that where you based off the gather, reason, communicate was based off of that? The whole like gather information through the experiences and through the readings and things like that. And is that kind of how you came up with that then?
Yeah, the gather, reason, communicate is based on constructivist learning theory. It is a simplification, a little bit of the 5 E's, but in science cuts to the chase and basically looks at, we have to build knowledge through experiences and through prior knowledge. If we're going to then use that to reason explanations for the cause of phenomena, develop models to represent those phenomena, or to develop arguments for how the evidence supports or refutes a specific explanation. And so the gather, reason, communicate, reasoning, the GRC, is basically this 3-step thing that is based on constructivist learning theory. You have to have a base for knowledge, and students come to our class with varying knowledge. And so we have to guarantee an experience that will give all of the students in our classroom a common experience to build off of. And then we need to provide readings, models, simulations, and other things that in fact support the students' knowledge of things that are happening at a scale that cannot be observed. And so the hands-on investigation becomes the important motivator for students to do that reading. Your job as a teacher isn't to teach science. The job is to motivate students to learn science. And that's a really big idea. I say it a lot. I don't think I've talked to any group of teachers in the last 10 years and not said that. Because we are very confused about this job. You know, it's not about stand and deliver. It's engage and inspire. See, science is about explanations supported by evidence. All the scientific argument does is simply says how the evidence that you've gathered supports or refutes that explanation you've developed. You can start with someone else's explanation, then argue for whether or not the evidence supports or refutes that. So I ask kids, give me an explanation. Now, what lines of evidence do you have, and how does that evidence support the explanation? Because oftentimes students collect evidence that doesn't support their explanation. It is not related to it, but they believe it's evidence. So instead of calling it a claim, I want the students to give me an explanation that they have evidence to support. So gather, reason, and communicate. It's an instructional sequence. And it begins with engaging kids in the scientific investigation, seeing the phenomena, making sense of the phenomena through gathering evidence, through hands-on investigation, readings, simulations, models. And then it moves into classroom discourse in which argumentation occurs. And then also onto the students communicating their reasoning. And then you communicate your reasoning through an explanation, a argument, or through a model. And the models in science actually represent either a relationship between things, or in fact, it does present the actual explanation, the mechanism by which something happens. So if I'm asking students, how does this happen? I'm asking them for the mechanism by which a phenomenon occurs. And sometimes we ask how of elementary students when we should just ask what, because for much of the how, the mechanisms are happening at a cellular level. The whys, the cause and effect relationship, are even happening at a more difficult level. And some of the why questions that I see in some curriculums should not be asked. We don't know what science doesn't know why. It's like gravity.
Science doesn't know why, so why should a 9-year-old?
Well, I don't know why. There's just gravity exists. I don't know why there's gravity, but gravity exists. I can't answer that why question, but I know that it does exist and how it functions, the mechanism by which gravity occurs.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's things in science that we need to be careful, those how and why words, but we want teachers using them all the time. So I encourage teachers in the books I write to use the how and why, and in professional development, the how and why questions rather than what and that question. But at some of the early grade levels, that's enough.
You know, what's interesting is that we wanted to have this podcast because we wanted to highlight what is science. But hearing you say that, it's almost like, how do we science? Why do we science? Instead of what is science? So now I want to scratch the whole title and refocus it. But one of the things you said as well really resonated with me is that science is not just observing what's happening, right? Like the earthquake would happen, you know, regardless, the sun is going to rise and set regardless. But it's our attempts as humans to kind of explain and understand what is happening. And I think of so many times, even as a kid, where I'd see a beautiful sunset and someone's like, yeah, that's science. But really that wasn't science. Explaining what made it beautiful or understanding the components that came together and what I was observing would be more along the lines of science.
Now, if we want to talk about sunset, we're probably going, unless we're going to be in the arts, which uses emotion to describe things. We're not going to talk about how beautiful it is. What we're going to talk about is what causes that phenomenon to occur. When I see that orange color, we have a lot of forest fires in the West where I live, and we have these incredible red sunset. Well, I know that there's a lot of particles in the air, and I understand refraction and reflection, and I understand wavelength. And these things that I'm using to make sense of that phenomenon occurring. Science is a human endeavor. And as humans, thank goodness, we seek explanations for everything. Mm-hmm. But what science does for us is puts this in place, this idea of evidence. If you're going to use that explanation, you've got to have evidence to support it. And so what we're looking at in science is investigating phenomena to find evidence that'll support an explanation for the causes of that phenomenon. And so we're constantly looking for different lines of evidence. And we can rely on others' expertise. We can do hands-on investigations, which we make observations of data and patterns in that data, so we can learn about these phenomena that occur. The good news is humans seek explanations for everything. Mm-hmm. The bad news is young children, with or without evidence, come up with explanations. We're after explanations supported by evidence. That's why argumentation is an important part of science. Mm-hmm. We're looking for explanations for the cause of the phenomena and the evidence that supports those explanations, or in some cases, refutes the explanation. That's what science is about. The nature of science is based on evidence. If you look in the appendices for the Next Generation Science Standards, I think Appendix G is called The Nature of Science. And in there, they talk about the nature of what science is all about. And this idea of evidence is a recurring theme, because without evidence, we are not talking science. If we're basing our decisions on emotion, then we're talking about the arts. If we're basing our understanding on faith, we're talking about religion. But in science, it's evidence. So all investigations should be looking for evidence to support the explanation. Sometimes I'll do an investigation with teachers and they say, well, we already know that. I will say to them, but what evidence do you have to support your understanding of that? Mm-hmm. And that is now science. Knowing something and having the evidence to support it are two different things. It's nice that you know it. Do you have any evidence that supports that explanation? Because we're talking about science here. And so evidence is what we want our students to say all the time. If you're ever in one of my PDs and you want a bingo card, put the word evidence and you'll win, because I'll use that word more than any other word, probably more than articles. I use that word evidence because I'm doing professional development for science teachers. And I'm trying to give them a simple, straightforward instructional sequence that they can engage their students with consistently and regularly. And the students will be able to make sense of things beyond the classroom, what I call analogous phenomena have the same cause. Whether it's the rainbow, the sunset, the aurora borealis, no matter what things they observe, they then begin looking at which of these core ideas I can use to make sense of that occurrence. The website we have, Going 3D with GRC, has collections of lessons. And one of the things I try to help teachers understand is try and get a relevant phenomenon, something close to you. If I'm in Utah, I'm going to be looking at Arches National Park and the weathering and erosion that caused those arches to occur. There's over 1,000 arches in this small area of southeast Utah. If I'm in Arizona, we're going to be talking about the Grand Canyon, the weathering and erosion of the Grand Canyon. If I'm in Hawaii, we're talking about beach erosion.
Right.
If I'm probably in Philadelphia, we're going to talk about road holes in the road. You don't call them what we call them. What do you call that hole in the road?
Pothole?
Potholes. So yeah, we call them chuck holes sometimes, but
You
because they
could
chuck
totally talk about potholes for a very long
pothole.
time with
Yeah,
any
because that
information.
pothole is caused, that circular pothole in your road is caused by the same thing that caused Arches National Park, but at a different scale.
Mhm.
And they're not as beautiful as arches, but they are caused by a weathering and erosion process of freeze thaw that creates that happening. And that's what we talk about. We want to get it relevant to the student. Now, we could talk about arches after we get kids engaged in making sense of those potholes they see in the road every day because it's relevant to them. I've had more than one teacher say to me, Brett, you've ruined my life. Everywhere I go, all I do
You
is talk
have.
about
You've ruined
phenomena
ours too,
and
'cause we see it
driving
everywhere.
my family crazy. Because once you get into this idea of seeing phenomena everywhere, like I can't go anywhere without seeing phenomena. It's
Right.
everything we do, I'm seeing phenomena. It makes my life much more interesting to me, but we engage them in looking for relevant phenomena. And part of the professional development I do is, in fact, these are different phenomena. Let's talk about one that's relevant to your students in where they live. And they can be culturally or locally relevant. The closer the students are to those phenomena, the more often they see them, the better those are in terms of motivating them to learn.
Brett, thank you so much for coming on the show, for sharing with us and helping us to figure out what science is and what science is not. On behalf of the entire Change Ed team, we want to thank all of our listeners for being so faithful, for always tuning in, for being part of this podcast. You're the most important part of this podcast because together we're changing education one podcast at a time. We want to remind you all that your job as a teacher is not to teach science, it's to engage and inspire students to learn science.
And subscribe.
Do that too.
Thanks.
Last word.